Hello, this is the first video about this book, The International Law on the Aims of Education. And this first video will be about chapter 1 and a little bit about why I wrote this book in the first place. And when I wrote the proposal about this book, one of the reviewers said that this book will probably just be interesting to international legal scholars and school educational scholars and teachers. They will not be interested in reading a book about international laws on the aims of education and actually legal topics. Who cares about that? So I had to kind of argue why law is important. And so I have a couple of points to make about that. First of all, if you're going to drive a car, you have to learn the traffic rules. We don't let anybody drive a car without making sure that they know the rules of the road, the traffic rules. Why do we want to let teachers take care of our children without knowing anything about the laws that govern that profession? And do we think that law doesn't matter in school at all? It doesn't really matter what happens in school. It doesn't have to be regulated by law. Just let teachers and the school do whatever they want with children. Let's let a teacher and the vice chancellors and the school leaders, they have all these children. Yeah, okay, just send them to us. We can do whatever we want with them. There are no laws that prohibits what we can do. Let's put them to work. Clean the floors, I don't know. There are laws. Teachers are not free to do whatever they want with children. And there are national laws, and then there are international laws. And this book is about international law on the aims of education. And we have to remember that, we have to remember that the right to education is not just a right, it's also compulsory. And I can't think of a single country in the world in which primary education, at least, is not compulsory for children. So basically, we all human beings on the planet is forced, kicking and screaming, to dedicate large parts of their life to this activity. And we say, you have to go to school. The law says that you have to go to school. No, they say, well, some children, they really like to go to school. But anyway, the point is that it's a compulsory activity. And when we force children to go to school, there should be some laws that govern what they are supposed to do there when they come there. And why write about the aims of education? I mean, because the aims of education governs everything. All the subjects in school, the pedagogical methods, what the teachers do, what they're supposed to do, is governed by the aims of education. It governs even what happens in teacher education and what teachers are taught to do. The aims of education governs the content of education. That's why this book is about the aims of education. And actually, I could have said the content of education, but that would have been I have a whole discussion about the means and the aims, and this thing is in chapter 9. But the thing is that the aims of education is what governs the content of education. Now, also I would say that I just want to make a point that education is one of these activities that might just involve the largest amount of people in most countries. Just think of all the school children all the teachers, all the parents of these school children. It's and it's one of the biggest government enterprises in most countries. So it's hugely expensive. So what the aims of education, the legal aims of education, why we do this, it's pretty important. And so I have a final argument. Well, so you can ask, okay, let's say that why do we need to learn about international laws of education? Why can't we just, we don't need international laws. Maybe we can just, say that, well, we have these national laws in each country. Who cares about the international law? Well, I have one story about that. And it starts with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is probably the most important human rights document that defines what human rights is. It's not technically legally binding. Well, it wasn't that in the beginning. Now it has become part of international customary law. But it was the first attempt by the United Nations to define the concept of human rights. And in the UN Charter, because if you read the UN Charter, you would see that promoting respect for human rights is one of the primary aims of the United Nations and the new world that was going to emerge after the Second World War. And the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, well, we try to define what do we mean by human rights. And Article 26 is about the right to education. And some states said that, well, let's just say that everybody has a right to education, but then leave it up to each state to define the aims of education. Now, there were some states and some agencies, among them UNESCO, which pointed out that Germany did actually respect the right to education in an excellent manner. It was fulfilled diligently by the Nazi Germans. It was the aims of that education, the content of that education, which was the problem. And so during these negotiations, there was this organization called the World Jewish Congress, which represented the Jewish people, and they were very adamant about the aims of education, or the spirit of education, as they called it. And so they had a proposal, which was first adopted, but then the second session after that, there was a new meeting, and some other states proposed, well, let's just delete this provision on the aims of education and just say that all the states can decide this by themselves. During that negotiations, Franz Rudolf Bielefeld, representing the World Jewish Congress and basically the Jewish people, and this was in 1947, he said that this provision on the aims of education, or the spirit of education as he called it, might just be the most important human right of them all. And so here you have the representative of the Jewish people. In 1947, just after Holocaust, they had lost 6 million people. And he was saying that the spirit of education was probably the most important human right of them all. Why? What about the right to life? What about the right not to be sentenced to death and sent to a death camp without trial? What about the freedom of religion, non-discrimination, these things? I think it's because he knew that whatever rights they had on paper, it wouldn't really matter unless the attitudes and the respect for them as people changed in societies. Because education is also about the changing of societies and the changing of norms and attitudes and how societies function. So yeah, and then we come to this question about what education is. I have in chapter 1, I have this section in which I discuss what is education. And at some point it becomes pretty difficult to distinguish between what education is as a concept and what the aims of education are, because sometimes these definitions, the definitions of what education is just, you know, citing what the aims of education are. But I would say this, I would say that aims of education at least involves four elements. It's about what knowledge do we want children to have, it's about what skills we want children to have, it's about what attitudes we want them to have, and it's about what values we want children to have. And why do we want them to have knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values? Because we want them to become good human beings, or at least functional human beings. And it's so the point is that there is no such thing as a neutral education, because there is no neutral answer to what a good human being is. I mean, education, if you're going to learn anything, you should learn something which is supposed to be a good thing, useful, at least to yourself. And so, if it's not neutral, if you can't say that there is an objective definition of what a good human being is, or an objective definition of what education should be about, then you have to find out, well, where do we find the answer to such questions? Where do we, how do we know what the aims of education should be? So you can turn to religion, you know, the Bible, the Bhagavad Gita, the Quran, the Kitab Yagdas, some you know, depends on which religion you are part of. You can turn to customs, you can turn to culture, you can turn to your feelings. I feel that this is right. And then is law. And law, there are national laws, and then there are international laws, and this book is about international law. And so, yeah, some would argue that there have been written books about the international, you know, human rights law on the aims of education, and there's this whole body of literature on human rights education. Now, I would say this: human rights education is about promoting respect for human rights, and I have this chapter in this book about human rights education, which is one of the aims of international law on the aims of education. But there are other aims of education which is not about just promoting respect for human rights. And I think it's pretty sick that this is the first book which, you know, discusses this whole body of the aims of education. And now, so you have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 26, which was adopted despite some of these states said. And following Article 26 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there has been adopted many treaties and conventions and also declarations and that says something about the aims of education. Now, the most important provision today about the aims of education is Article 29 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Now, the Convention on the Rights of the Child has been adopted by all states in the world except the United States of America. So, and this provision on the aims of education, there is one country which has declared that they are not bound by it or made a reservation, and that is Turkey. So you can say that except for Turkey and the US, all states in the world agree to these aims of education in Article 29 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So I have in this book this provision become, and it's also the most detailed provision on the aims of education. So this provision has become sort of the main core text which I use to discuss all the aims of education. Because if you're going to make law practical, you have to make sure that you focus on the text of the law. And so I focused on the text of Article 29 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And it doesn't mean that in focusing on that one text, I bring in all the other treaties and declarations and to highlight how do we understand Article 29. So that's why this book, the headline is International Law on the Aims of Education in general, not just focusing on Article 29 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So yeah, in the next video I will talk about chapter 2, which is about what is international law, and can we say that the aims of education and the laws that govern the aims of education is real international, or is it real law, or just some sort of fairy tale law?